The Oracle's Gift. When I received the call about my grandmother's passing, I felt a mix of sorrow and confusion. She had always been the family enigma, shrouded in mystery and stories of ancient times. The news came with a peculiar request. I was to inherit her most prized possession, an ancient amulet with an opal center, set in gold filigree. The lawyer handed it to me at the reading of her will. The amulet was heavier than I expected, and as I touched it, a strange warmth spread through my fingers. That night, I wore it to bed, hoping it would bring me closer to her memory. Instead, it brought me visions. The first vision was disorienting. I was in the cockpit of an airplane looking through the eyes of the pilot. He seemed anxious, beads of sweat on his forehead, his hands trembling slightly on the controls. Suddenly, the scene shifted to chaos. Alarms blared, passengers screamed, and the plane plummeted. I jolted awake, gasping for breath, the amulet cool against my skin. I couldn't shake the vividness of the dream. The next day, I met my best friend Sam for lunch. Sam was the only person I felt could understand the gravity of what I was experiencing. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Sam remarked as I slid into the booth. "I think I might have," I replied, recounting the dream. It felt so real, like it was actually happening. Sam leaned forward, eyes wide with intrigue. "You think it's connected to the amulet?" I nodded. "There's something about it, Sam. I think it's showing me the future." Over the next few days, the visions became more frequent and detailed. I saw the pilot, Captain Thomas Green, more clearly. He was ignoring symptoms of what seemed like a severe illness, determined to fly despite his worsening condition. The flight number, the departure time, and the destination, everything became clear. The plane was scheduled to fly from New York to Los Angeles in just 3 days. Sam and I spent hours researching Captain Green and the flight. Every detail matched my visions. We had to find a way to stop him from flying, but we needed proof. Something more than my unsettling dreams. Desperation led us to the airline's headquarters. We demanded to speak to someone in charge, and after much persistence, we were granted a meeting with a security officer named Mr. Bennett. I explained the situation as best as I could without sounding completely insane. "You expect me to ground a flight based on a dream?" Mr. Bennett asked, skepticism etched on his face. "Please," I implored, showing him the detailed notes and the consistency of my visions. "Just check on Captain Green's health. It's all I'm asking." Reluctantly, Mr. Bennett agreed to investigate. As we left, I felt a glimmer of hope, but it was quickly overshadowed by the uncertainty of whether we had done enough. That night, another vision came. This time it was darker, more urgent. I saw the amulet's past, its origin tied to an ancient oracle who could foresee disasters and guide her people to safety. My grandmother, and now I, had inherited this gift, but it came with the burden of responsibility. The morning of the flight, Sam and I anxiously awaited news. Hours passed with no word. Just as despair began to set in, my phone rang. It was Mr. Bennett. "You were right," he said, a mix of disbelief and relief in his voice. "Captain Green was hospitalized this morning. Severe viral infection. The flight was reassigned to another pilot." I exhaled, the weight of impending disaster lifting. We had done it. We had prevented the catastrophe. But the relief was tempered by the realization of what the amulet truly was and what it meant for my future. Sam and I celebrated that night, but my mind kept drifting back to the vision of the oracle. I needed to understand more about my heritage and the amulet's deeper powers. In the following weeks, I delved into my grandmother's journals and ancient texts she had collected. I learned that the amulet was a conduit for prophetic visions, passed down through generations to guide and protect. It required not just the ability to see, but the courage to act on those visions. With Sam's support, I embraced this newfound role. The amulet's visions became a part of my life, each one a puzzle to solve, a potential disaster to avert. I was no longer just Maya. I was a guardian of the future, a bearer of the Oracle's gift. The plane crash was the first of many challenges. Each vision tested my resolve, but with each successful intervention, I grew more confident in my abilities. The amulet, once a mysterious artifact, became a symbol of my purpose. Sam and I formed a team, combining our skills to interpret the visions and take preventive measures. The journey was fraught with danger and skepticism, but we persevered, driven by the knowledge that we were making a difference. In the end, the amulet did more than grant me visions. It revealed my true lineage and forged a path I never expected to walk. The Oracle's gift was not just a burden, but a beacon, illuminating the darkness and guiding us toward a safer future. And with each vision, I honored my grandmother's legacy, carrying her wisdom and courage into every step I took.
The Silent Town. My name is Detective Lucas Gray, and this is the story of how I stumbled into a nightmare. It began with a routine investigation, or so I thought, into the disappearances in a remote town called Silent Creek. Located deep in the forested mountains, the town was eerily isolated, almost forgotten by time. The drive up was long and uneventful, but as I approached the town, an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. The road narrowed, flanked by dense trees that seemed to close in on me. When I finally saw the town's entrance, marked by a worn sign, I couldn't shake the sense of foreboding. Silent Creek was quaint, with old rustic buildings and a river that whispered its way through the town. But something was off. The streets were deserted, windows shuttered, and an oppressive silence hung in the air. I checked into the only inn, an old, creaky place run by a woman named Margaret. Her eyes darted nervously as she handed me the key. "Any word on the disappearances?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Margaret's hands trembled. "No one knows anything, Detective. People just vanish." I nodded, deciding not to press her further for now. The room was sparse but clean. After settling in, I started my investigation, beginning with the local sheriff, an old man named Harold, who seemed more weary than helpful. "We've searched everywhere," Harold said, his voice resigned. "The woods, the river. No bodies, no signs. It's like they were swallowed by the earth." My next stop was the local diner. Inside, a few townsfolk eyed me warily. An old man named George, sitting alone at a corner table, beckoned me over. "You're here about the disappearances, ain't you?" he rasped. "That's right," I replied, sitting down across from him. "What do you know?" George leaned in, his voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They won't tell you, but this town's cursed. Folks here worship something ancient, something evil. They call it the Silent One." "Silent One?" I repeated, skeptical. "Aye," George said, glancing around nervously. "They believe it demands sacrifices. Those who disappear, they're taken." Before I could ask more, George clammed up, his eyes wide with fear. I left the diner with more questions than answers, but George's words echoed in my mind. That night, I barely slept, haunted by the notion of an ancient entity lurking in the shadows. The following days were a blur of dead ends and growing paranoia. The townsfolk grew increasingly hostile, their eyes following me with thinly veiled suspicion. I felt like an intruder, a disruption in their carefully guarded secret. One evening, as I was reviewing my notes in my room, a loud knock startled me. Opening the door, I found George, pale and trembling. "They know you're looking," he whispered urgently. "Meet me at the old church on the hill. Midnight." The old church was a decaying relic, its steeple reaching toward the starless sky. I arrived early, the air thick with unease. Inside, the pews were covered in dust, and a foul odor permeated the air. As midnight approached, George entered, looking more terrified than ever. "They're coming for you," he said. "You need to leave, now." "Not until I know what's going on," I insisted. "Who are they? What is the Silent One?" Before George could answer, the church doors burst open, and a group of townsfolk stormed in, their faces twisted with fanaticism. Leading them was Margaret, her eyes cold and determined. "You shouldn't have come here, detective," she said, her voice void of emotion. "The mob seized us, and despite my struggle, they dragged us to the heart of the forest, where a large stone altar stood in a clearing. The air was thick with the scent of burning incense, and the flickering torchlight cast eerie shadows. Margaret began to chant in a language I didn't recognize, the others joining in. I realized with growing horror that George had been right. This was a ritual, and I was the next sacrifice. "Why are you doing this?" I shouted, desperate. "The Silent One demands it," Margaret replied, her eyes glazed with fervor. "Only through sacrifice can we appease it and protect the town." They forced me onto the altar, and I felt the cold stone against my back. The chanting grew louder, and a knife glinted in Margaret's hand. As she raised it high, I knew I had seconds to act. With a surge of adrenaline, I broke free, knocking Margaret off balance. The knife clattered to the ground, and chaos erupted. George tackled one of the cultists, and I managed to grab a torch, brandishing it to keep the others at bay. "Run!" I yelled at George, and together we fled into the forest, the cultists close behind. Branches whipped my face, and the ground was treacherous, but we didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest. Gasping for breath, we hid in the underbrush, listening as the mob's footsteps faded away. "We can't go back," George panted. "They'll never stop." "I need to stop them," I said, determination hardening my voice. "But we need help. We need to expose them." The next few days were a blur of careful planning and gathering evidence. George and I managed to send a message to the nearest town, and soon, reinforcements arrived. Armed with the truth and a small army, we confronted the cult. The confrontation was brutal, but the cultists, deprived of their mystique and secrecy, fell quickly. Margaret and the other leaders were arrested, and the town was liberated from the grip of fear. In the aftermath, the townsfolk were dazed, many unaware of the true horrors that had taken place. The Silent One's altar was destroyed, and Silent Creek began the slow process of healing. As I left the town, George by my side, I couldn't help but feel a deep sadness for the lives lost to the cult's madness. Silent Creek would never be the same, but it had a chance to rebuild, free from the shadows that had plagued it for so long. "Thank you," George said quietly as we reached the town's edge. I nodded, unable to find the right words. The experience had changed me too, leaving scars that would never fully heal. As I drove away, the town's name faded in my rearview mirror, but the memory of Silent Creek and its dark secrets would stay with me forever.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing for more content like this.